It's nice to be here again in Manchester. Good to see you all, and what a good turnout. It's obviously an important theme, and it concerns us a lot, even though many of us, I assume, are very involved in one way or another with making the world better. We, in fact, are finding ourselves in a world that's almost deteriorating inevitably, irrevocably, and that's deeply worrying. So, yeah, I'm very pleased that Stephen thought to invite me here and talk about it, but I'm not going to repeat exactly what I said 8 years ago in that lecture, Stephen. I hope you don't mind, because some of these good people might have read the pamphlet already, and they think, well, he can't go on that, on that tack. But anyway, I've had more thoughts about it. I'm reading it again recently. I thought, yeah, there's more to be said on this. Indeed, times are getting darker. The situation is more and more difficult to negotiate. I've got to think and meditate more on this than I have done. So I'm giving you something of a new take. And if people want to spend, what was it, £50, did you say? So, on this little pamphlet, it's a shame, really. It is expensive. And I don't think Friends House Bookshop sell these Pendle Hill pamphlets anymore. No. They do?
Yeah. Some.
Ah, good. So they will get this, will they?
Certainly I got a copy from Friends House Bookshop.
You got it there. Well,
there is a copy of the Nazarene Theological College Library.
Very good. That's good. That's good news, Robert. Thank you. So here is some new thoughts, but on the same sort of line, because I think I had struck some sort of a golden seam of Quaker spirituality when I was searching for some understanding. I felt I had to go deep, as it were, to continue that image deeper down the mine to find a better seam than the one that I was drawing on at the time. And most of us are, as Quakers. I'm thinking, for example, of the way in which we might reflect for a few minutes in a meeting for worship about something that concerns us and just wait for some ideas to come up. And then perhaps read a book or have a discussion group, and we've got it clear in our minds then what we have in mind. I found I had to go much deeper than this. And I was encouraged in reading some early Quaker texts, as I have been now for 40, 50 years, that they understood very well what it is to live in dark times. And I think you've all got access to this sheet of paper, have you? You've got advice from William Penn on one side, and the declaration to King Charles on the other side, which you'll be familiar with. I'm going to refer to these off and on during the course of the talk, but note first of all this very first paragraph from William Penn, number 1 there, just that first paragraph. Now, this is a book that is often introduced as William Penn's aphorisms on how to live well, how to conduct your life in a reasonable way. And it shows the influence of some of the Enlightenment figures who were talking at that time. I think you'll see this is not the approach of a man who's concerned primarily to solve things rationally. This is his understanding of the world that he was living in. This is in the 1690s, so he was getting on a bit in his 50s. England was a good deal more settled than it had been for many years. There was no more intolerance and imprisonment of Quakers, for example, in the 1690s. So this is addressed to everybody, this book. Can you see the bottom? It's the book called Fruits of Solitude, or Some Fruits of Solitude. I would recommend that, and you can buy it nowadays very cheaply under that one. We understand little of the works of God, either in nature or grace. Now, just see how much of this resonates with our understanding of what's going on today. We pursue false knowledge and mistake education extremely. We are violent in our affections, confused and unmethodical in the whole of our life. making that a burden which was given for a blessing, and so of little comfort to ourselves or others, misapprehending the true notion of happiness, and so missing of the right use of life and way of happy living. Wow, that is a very dark experience of life. And I'll read the next paragraph because he's got his own answer to this, which I will come back to. I'm sorry, goodness me, I should turn that off. He's coming back to it later, but look at this next paragraph, how it ends. And until we are persuaded to stop and step a little aside out of the noisy crowd and encumbering hurry of the world and calmly take a prospect of things, it will be impossible we should be able to make a right judgment of ourselves or know our own misery. So he's saying we'll not deal with any of those problems I've just told you about until we know how to stop and step aside a little and look at things, as it were, from a distance. That's what he's saying. But after we have made a just reckoning, which retirement will help us to, we shall begin to think the world in great measure mad, and that we've been in a sort of bedlam all this while. Bedlam, do you remember that? It was the first lunatic asylum in Britain, one of the first in the world, named after Bethlehem. It's short for Bethlehem. And it was a byword at that time for madness. And it's often referred to by people at that time. They would go and see Bedlam. It was, for some of them, an afternoon's entertainment. And you could look through the grill and see these poor people suffering. But this wasn't just entertainment. This was a kind of terror. This is what they were afraid of. And this, in the beginning of the Age of Reason, as it was called, was the fear they had that they would all end up somehow in this state of losing their mind, losing their sense of what was right or proper or safe, and what could be trusted. Except that Penn was saying, no, this is where we are. This isn't what's going to happen. This is where we are now. We are living in Bedlam. People do not know what makes for a happy life, how to be secure, how to treat others decently so that they will treat you. We're lost, we're in the dark. So that's why I got interested very much in William Penn. I think perhaps because he, more than other early Quakers, got really interested in the world and how it could be improved. Indeed, he was a man of the world. And it was, as you probably know, he was a personal advisor to both King Charles II and then to his brother James. He was so closely connected with James, actually, that many Quakers began to have serious doubts about him. How can a Quaker, support a man who's supposed to be a Catholic, of all things? And it was that time when the Catholic Protestant thing was very, very bitter in this country. But better than all that, Penn, I'm not going to go into this, I'd love to. I've written a chapter on this in my new book, so chapter 5, you'll see what his great experiment in America was all about. He decided that he could actually demonstrate what a true government would be like. Not like this, but with open discourse, as he called it, honest, truthful communication where people learn to trust them, and everybody within the whole community would be involved in the process of government, including children, and lunatics for that matter. They would all be involved. What a vision he had, and people haven't taken that on because it's too much of a Quakerly vision. It's a too spiritual thing. So most books about Penn will talk about this just rational approach to democracy, introducing some Whig ideas about how to have a fair government and to involve, the people who were entitled to government. No, his was not a few elected representatives from the educated classes. It was everybody involved in the discernment of what was right for their colony. But that's another story. Only to say, of course, that it indicates how well Penn understood the issues in his world. And Charles himself, King Charles and James, were amazed at what was going on. People in France like Voltaire and other of those philosophes, as they called themselves, in the early 18th century were amazed at what Penn was doing there and then. And Voltaire wrote about it in his essays on England. This was a model for the future. So Penn understood why things were going wrong. But this is what was very interesting to me when I looked into this. This did not come from studying political ideology or finding some sort of analysis of what was going on. There was no discussion of the rights of kings, which was a big issue at the time, or what a democracy might look like, since Cromwell had rather made a mess of things, it seems. There was a lot of discussion about all that, and Penn was in touch with many of these people, some of the leading figures within the Whig Party, certainly, and Anglican liberal-minded people who were engaged more in politics and looking for a more tolerant society. All that was true, but that was not Penn's approach. Penn's approach was, you just heard it, stop and step aside a little, out of the noisy crowd and encumbering hurry of the world, and calmly take a prospect of things. What he had in mind there was precisely the Quaker practice of going silent and still and giving up all talk, all thought, all planning, all negotiation, and simply waiting for the reality of the situation to be disclosed to you. Now that is what he'd learnt that from George Fox, of course, and Margaret Fell and those other Quakers. He was a later convinced Quaker from the late 1660s, so a good 15 years after Fox's movement really got going. It was Thomas Lowe, in fact, who preached somewhere in Dublin, was it, or Cork? I'm just forgetting for the moment now. But he was there on his father's business. His father, Sir William Penn, was a landowner as well as a great admiral of the fleet. But he attended this meeting. He'd heard that the Quakers, he'd come across them when he was a student in Oxford. So he went to hear Thomas Lowe, and Thomas Lowe said something like, I've had to uncover it because we get rather little from the report, but it seems that Thomas Lowe said that you cannot actually live your own spiritual life if you're not engaged fully with the world. And nor can you engage fully and productively with the world unless you have a spiritual life. So that light in you must guide you in the whole of your life, in your personal life and your public life. You must bring that light to bear on the injustice of the world. And if you want to know what those injustices are about and how they arise, then you don't read your book by Hobbes or Locke or whatever he was writing at the time about these very things. You will go into your own heart and search there. So this is what he means when he talks about after we have made a just reckoning, which retirement will help us to. Retirement was William Penn's favourite word, really, for what we'd just been doing together, going silent. But it's a very business-like activity. It wasn't just going silent and waiting for something to come up. There was a very serious and well-focused kind of attention that was brought to this silence. This he learned from George Fox. And you can see that in the journal, though it's never spelt out terribly clearly there. It's a lot clearer, actually, in many of Fox's epistles. I had the temerity to plough through these things years ago, many of which are very hard and wordy and actually badly written, you have to say, but sometimes with wonderful depth and clarity. And I realized why Fox then had such a huge influence. He was penetrating to the very issues which then concerned people, which had a lot to do with the Civil War, of course, where religion seemed to have led to violence and where even Cromwell's government couldn't cope with the divisions, but also the very theology, the very way that they were told to think about themselves, based on the Bible. The Bible was, as it were, waved at them from the pulpit, and they were told by the preachers, this is what God says, this is God's word, believe it. And what exactly it means, I can explain to you because I've studied this at Cambridge. you see. And that was beginning to raise doubts in people's minds. These preachers have studied the Bible, and so they can tell me how to live. They can tell me what's going on in my life. This didn't match. And Fox himself, of course, was focused on that very issue. The preachers tell me this, but it doesn't work. That's not how I feel. And it's obviously not how they feel either, because they are not living a model life either, according to what they say. And this is the sort of doubt that led Fox to question how you could ever get to the reality of life and its possibilities if you can't rely on the official teaching of the preachers or the doctrines of or what the king did or said, or what they agreed in Parliament. And that's when Fox, do you remember, he said, it's a famous passage early in the journal, when he really has an awakening. Unforgettable words. Now, what are they? You'll be familiar with them. As I gave up on the priests and the preachers and even the experienced people, so those are the people who trusted the Bible as everybody did, but felt it had to be applied to experiences. When I gave up on all these and everything that everybody had said, so that I had nothing outwardly to help me, then I heard a voice which said, there is someone that can speak to your condition, even Christ Jesus. And then my heart filled with joy. Jesus indeed enlightens and gives grace, faith, and power. This I knew experimentally. Wow. So he's using the very language of the scientists of that time there, experimentally. This doesn't mean just by experience. It means this I knew to be true by experience is proved to be true. I know it because it's proved in my experience to be the case. He was saying that was true of this revelation that Christ gave. And what Christ did, this in Christ, because clearly this is not the Christ of the Bible or the image of the Puritan theology, the ascended God-man figure beyond, because nothing outwardly could help me. And this voice is about something within him. So that's why he goes silent. And that's why he doesn't trust what people say initially. He does later when he's able to judge whether it comes from that inner truth. What he's finding in himself deep down is that Christ, or the light, it's used almost interchangeably, will actually show him the reality of his life if he allows it to. So the reason he goes silent, the reason he stops talking and reading and debating with people, not that these things weren't important in their way, but they did not go to the depth. They didn't give him the reality of what he really felt, what he was experiencing, what he was missing when he said, these people, they did not speak to my condition. So he knew his condition, at least well enough to know that they had not got it right. As he experienced life, this was not how they spoke to him. And I think the other great thing about Fox, which I know impressed Penn, and I think all the others too, was that this attention to the light, though it first of all looked rather dark, and I'm coming on to darkness now, you see, in fact led to a great sort of liberation. I mean, what was worrying about Fox's message initially, and many people said this, they were alarmed. Don't give us all that stuff about darkness and evil. Because he was saying, you can find freedom for yourself and liberation and for yourself if you face the darkness. And that's the last thing people want to do. There was actually at that time quite a deep despair about human beings and their possibilities. There's no doubt about that. And the Puritans had encouraged that. I don't know if you've ever come across the Puritan catechism that all children had to learn, not just read, they had to learn it. So children were asked throughout the country, when they were little kids, they were said, now, how do you know what is the right thing to do? We know the right thing to do because God has revealed it in the Ten Commandments. And where do you find the Ten Commandments? There are 10 Commandments in the Bible. And what are they? What do they say? Thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not. And can you do this? No. None of us can do it. We are all evil. What will happen if we disobey the Ten Commandments? We'll be condemned by God forever in hell. That's what they read. And that's what, of course, most people believed. And therefore, they would come back to the church so that they could be forgiven for this. But it wouldn't last that long, because basically they were ill. They were sick with sin. Sin was such an all-prevailing power. Evil was something thought to be dominant. So even a secular philosopher like Thomas Hobbes, who was a contemporary of Fox, he wrote a distinguished book in 1651, The Leviathan, on the nature of evil. Even he argued on this rational basis that people were unable to establish a peaceful society. Remember, this 1651 is just after the Civil War, but before Cromwell starts to put things right. They live in a natural state of war, and it's only when they have a strong government to contain them that they will have any peace at all. So you need someone like Cromwell or a king to hold people in their place so that this natural evil within them doesn't break free. And of course, that was therefore a fear when they heard these preachers. Women would stand up in the marketplaces. This was a shameful thing in itself, they thought. But to tell us, that we must look at ourselves and face the evil was just asking for trouble. And look what happens. Women start talking and have authority to speak. This was outrageous. And many other things happened the Quakers did. They were living out of something that other people did not understand and didn't dare to trust themselves. But I think it got through to a number of people that what Fox had discovered was actually very powerful indeed. And that is that if you look at what is wrong, whatever that is, whatever your troubles your conscience, in that attitude of detached observation, like Penn says here, you don't engage with it, you don't try to sort it out, you allow yourself to go into a passive mode, receptive, attentive, open-eyed, without thinking, and you ask yourself, what is really going on here? You will find, first of all, that you will see clearly what is going on. You will see what you are doing, or what other people are doing around you in your experience, and even if this is shocking or worrying or shameful initially, as Fox said in one of his great early epistles, be patient, wait, for then the ego will, not the ego, that's my translation, the self will be brought down. Okay, so what happens, this is what impressed Fox, is when you look honestly and openly at what's happening in your life as it becomes apparent to you, you find you're able to get a certain distance. He talks about being able to look over the darkness. As the light appeared, he says, it says this in his great letter to Elizabeth Claypole, Cromwell's daughter. I can recommend this. It's a wonderful long letter that he wrote to this woman who's depressed and upset about her life. And he says, that's the letter where he says, you may know this phrase, be still and cool in your own mind and spirit from your own thoughts. And then you will feel the principle of God to lead you up to God. Be still and cool, in a very modern sense, actually. That's what he meant by it. You just detached, unimportant. Be still and cool from your own thoughts and feelings in your own spirit. And then you will begin to see things clearly. But then he says later in this letter, don't go on looking at the darkness, because if you look just at the darkness, you will be swallowed up in it. But look at the light which shows you this, and then you will feel over it and rise above it. And there it's the beginning of peace. There you will have victory. Now, can you see the logic of what he's saying there? This was, I think, an extraordinary discovery that Fox had. It's a bit like some mystical writing you might have come across before that time, but it's much more focused on this reality I and we are living now. I think that was the genius of the early Quaker movement, drawing on the Puritans who were concerned about how we live our everyday life in the world, but without any doctrine, without any preaching of a formal kind, but drawing on the insights that we each gain when we look honestly at the things that trouble us. We face the evil, but in facing it in this detached way, we can not only see where it comes from, but we can see how we can do otherwise. We're not in the grip of it. We're not swallowed up by it, as Fox said, because we're aware that there's something in us that enables us to see it. There's something in us deep down which is truthful and insightful and compassionate and powerful. This is not our normal self at all. This is some very deep self, some very deep source of wisdom and insight and compassion, which we can tap and draw on, but isn't our normal way of thinking. It was very difficult, of course, for Fox and others to convey that to other people, which is why they said, try it out for yourselves. William Penn has a very good letter where someone's complaining that it can't do anybody any good to be looking at all that's wrong or evil, as they said. And Penn said, no, it's very difficult for me to explain this. How can we possibly explain this? You have to see it for yourself. I had to, you do, we all have to. We must experiment. We must try. And it's not a difficult experiment, although it's challenging to face all the things that you find difficult or anxiety-provoking, whatever they are. But in that detached state of mind, you will find the light enables you to see it, where it comes from, and how you can live otherwise. Indeed, you find you want to live otherwise, because that is not the truth. And that's another thing I think becomes, I think the third thing, if I'm adding them up with Fox, the huge discovery is that people have access to truth, reality, within themselves. Everyone does. Insofar as they experience life, they can understand what's going on. It's the ideas, the prejudices, the self which gets anxious. That was their particular concern, the self-will that pushes itself, that asserts its authority, and therefore distorts the reality. Always distorts the reality. And that's one reason we don't live well. So I've gone on quite a bit about that, but I feel I wanted to make that clear because this is the clue to understanding how they saw the world. And it was Penn, I think, more than others. I want to take you to another quotation with Penn, perhaps those next two, because this shows you how he is applying the insights that he learned from Fox and Thomas Lowe and Margaret Fell, these people, and how he could apply it to the world. Number two, actually, it's written to his children some years later. It's one of the last things he wrote, a book of advices to his children, who took, actually, not a blind bit of notice of what Penn said. It's a shame. Before this, he's been saying, whatever you do in the day, be aware of how it's affecting you. This is how your meditation in the morning and in the evening, he recommends this regular discipline to them. Even if you're reading the Bible, notice how it's affecting you and why it is you're reading this and why you want to be reading it. So there's a degree of self-awareness there, which was very unusual at that time. But I think it's astute. Anyway, having said all that about reading, he says, rather meditate than read much. For the spirit of a man knows the things of a man, a quotation from Paul. And with this spirit, by the observation of the tempers and actions of men you see in the world, and looking into your own spirit and meditating thereupon, you will have a deep and strong judgment of men and things. So way beyond your own immediate sphere. For from what may be and should be and what is most probable and likely to be, you can hardly miss in your judgment of human affairs. And you have a better spirit than your own in reserve for a time of need, to pass the final judgment in important matters. That better spirit than your own, I like that. It's such a lovely, sort of bleak, simple way of describing this depth within us that we can't normally describe at all, which could be related to the Spirit or Christ or the deep self or whatever. Well, this is different. And note that he's just quoted Paul, who says the Spirit, I think it's in Corinthians, the Spirit of a man knows the things that are in a man. And that's why Paul is saying we need the Spirit of God to know about God. You can't know about God by using your own intelligence. So there's a similar shift here. You know what's going on in your own life. That is the spirit of a man or a woman. But in time of need, when you feel you're at the limit, you don't understand, you need a spirit better than your own. And that's there too. That's what he's saying. And this will help you to judge what's going on. And this is summarized in this third quotation, which for me was a stunning realization when I came across this first of all. Because I'd wondered myself whether Fox or the others really felt confident that the light within would help them to know how to approach politics or social life or the wider questions of the world. And this is what Penn said. Having claimed that the Quakers were not troublemakers, I should point that out. This is what he's arguing in this piece. They were not out to get to the government or rebel for its own sake. They didn't have any great plan, no grand design was his phrase. But, number 3, but God, having given them a sight of themselves, they saw the whole world in the same glass of truth, and sensibly discerned the passions and affections of men and the rise and tendency of things. Okay, so he's saying, this is a nice image, the light within, he's saying, which you gain access to when you go silent and still. It's like a magic mirror, and you look at it and you see yourself. Maybe a bit surprised you want to know the truth, and so here's the mirror, what does he call it? Yeah, here's the glass of truth. Have a look in the mirror. It's me, exactly. That's what you have to see first of all. You have to see yourself exactly as you are, truthfully, honestly, and accept that. But then, I think this is the implication, you can turn the mirror slightly and you will see the rest of the world in that same glass. So that gave me the astonishing idea that Penn would be able to meditate silently on what was going on in Whitehall, or in Pennsylvania, for that matter, where he became the governor. And I did actually, that's one thing I've written about in this new chapter, Ben. He actually set about to design the government. Nobody's written about this, can you believe it? He set about, Jane Calvert has in her book, some PhD thesis at Yale University, I discovered that. She writes about the Quaker politics of that time, which she said is based on Quaker principles. But she doesn't understand this practice I've been talking about. And Penn refers to that. He said, we began and ended our assembly as all the representatives of the whole of the huge colony the size of Wales, all gathered together, all having consulted their families and friends and everybody else before they come to this. We begin and end with prayer. And the silence, just as in general meeting, he says, back in England. So there were also decisions, this is passed over almost casually. These were decisions made nem-con. No voting, no parties, no proposals, no debates. Instead, they had reports on what was happening, and then people would discern together in silence initially, and then each listening carefully to the other in open discourse so they could understand exactly what this situation was and what it required. And when they achieved unity, all 300 of them, when they achieved unity, they would take action. And one of the editors of his papers remarks, almost as if it was to be expected, there was complete harmony between Penn and the colonizers during the first 2 years. There were then serious debates and issues, no doubt. They hit problems. But this is astonishing. No government had ever experienced that before. And that impressed the French philosophers. So what I'm saying is, in a sense, this is equivalent to George Fox saying, "This I knew experimentally." This, in his own experience, and everybody can know it experimentally. Penn is saying, "This I know experimentally. A government can be run by following the light within." He didn't use that phrase, but it was a slightly different, slightly more secular way of framing it, so that people could access this, whatever religion they might be. As long as they trusted there's something divine in you, that will be enough. They were welcome in Pennsylvania, and they could take part in the politics. So that's a more positive side of it. But first of all, of course, what is the time now? I'm gone over my time, haven't I?
No, you're not.
Okay. Okay. First of all, you've got to understand this crazy world, this bedlam in which we're living. And one very interesting approach to that is to look at the text we all know quite well about the peace testimony. We tend to call it the peace testimony, but if you look at it, it's on the other side of your sheet of paper. The testimony as such is not this document, but their resolve not to use violence, their non-violent life, their non-violent commitment. Now, you'll know you'll be familiar with this. It's in Quaker Faith and Practice. It's often described as the first statement of the Quaker peace testimony, in which the Quakers declared, the first time clearly, that violence was wrong, that war was wrong, and we should therefore be all opposed to these things. It's a moral thing. And everybody is bound to do it and capable of doing it. It's just a matter of policy. We refuse to use weapons. Well, it's true they refuse to use weapons, but if you look carefully, this takes a lot more than a simple moral resolve. And I suppose I'm reacting here to a document I read again recently from 100 years ago, which is a restatement of the Quaker Peace Testimony. In 1920, there was a very big conference held in London, the first World Conference of Quakers, which was very impressive, I have to say. I don't know if any of you have read about that, but it is a wonderful event. And I think Ruth Fry herself was one of the highlights of that remarkable event. But the peace testimony, although it's very well stated, is still presented as a moral ideal that others and everybody should follow. This, of course, was just a couple of years after the end of the First World War, and Quakers were taken very seriously at that time. They had proved to be right, you see. That's what many people thought. So the peace testimony was catching on, and in a serious way. But this is not how they understood it initially. They realized that it would need a big change of heart for people even to envisage the possibility of not being violent. And that's how violent the society was at that time. The government depended on violence. Everything had to be backed up by carnal weapons. So what I suggest is I read, and you read with me, the translation I've offered, which I think will help clarify how this is different from the way we tend to think of the peace testimony today. Can you see, though, the second part then is my translation into modern English of the original text. Our principle is what we have always in fact practiced, to seek for peace and to follow what is right and conducive to knowing God, seeking the good and welfare of all and doing what makes for peace between them. That's quite a good ideal for any society, you see. That is what they are themselves seeking. We know that fighting and war proceed from human passions. Epistle of James 1:4, 1-3. Passions from which the Lord has delivered us. So he's delivered us from the cause of war itself. The cause of war and war itself, in which envious people who love themselves more than God, by the way, not for, more than God, lust after people's lives or property, and therefore, I put in, therefore kill for it, arise from this passion. Let me repeat that sentence. I put that therefore in just to highlight the logic of what's being said there, which can be missed otherwise. The cause of war and war itself, in which envious people who love themselves more than God lust after people's lives or property and therefore kill for it, arise from this passion. So we utterly reject all principles and practices of violence. So that comes from the statement that the Lord has delivered us from this passion. The passion to have people's property or lives, to own them, to control them in some way. So we utterly reject all principles and practice of violence in our own lives. That is, that's a translation of as to our own particulars. Along with all physical war and strife, all fighting and material weapons, for any purpose or under any pretense whatever. And this is our solemn declaration to the whole world. I think that's not quite adequate as a translation of this is our testimony to the whole world. But testimony was being used at that time to refer to solemn declarations, but it always did carry that sense of bearing witness to what you know to be true from your experience. And I shouldn't have lost that in the translation. Just have to bear that in mind. It's a biblical idea of testimony too. It's when you bear witness to what you know, and the court, the people generally need to know. And this is what the Quakers themselves understood by their testimony. They're giving up of violence. It's not their statement, you understand. They're giving up of violence as a way of life to pursue these ends which are concerned with righteousness and peace. This is their testimony. See what they say. It's being lived out. This is an active witness through the way they themselves live without violence. And it could be done in their everyday life. It could even be done in a new colony where there was no violence for 2 or 3 years at all. That is the witness which speaks louder than words, you see. So this is our solemn declaration to the whole world, I put it. We have rejected fighting a war because the Lord has called us to obey his truth. So we cannot now take them up again. This is a confident declaration to the whole world of the truth of our hearts in this case, in the hope that they receive it as God persuades everyone's heart to accept it. So there again, that's the other thing that gets missed in modern interpretations. This is not a testimony to good policy or to moral living or some ideal of peace. This is a testimony to reality, truth. They're saying this works. We can prove it. We can show it in our lives. See what happens when you open yourself to what's really going on and live without violence. That is, because you're not afraid of other people. You're not trying. Now, that's the other thing. I think I ought to wind up actually there. But the other thing is, you see, they're freed from this obsession with violence because they don't need to control other people. They have no desire, as other people do, to own property or people and make them work for me, for us. They've been free from that desire. They can let go and accept exactly what they have, no more, no less. And that tells us the flip side of that is that the cause of war and violence and domination in society is that people want property. They want to own things. They want to have control, either of people or things, because they do not feel safe in themselves. They do not trust the people around them. They've set themselves up against others, and so there are inner conflicts between people. As Hobbes said, people are in conflict, but only because they're not accepting who they are, what they are, and their relationships with one another. If they did, they would be happy to live in peace and to share their life together. That's a very quick summary of how those early Quakers came to see the world, which was indeed dark. But they had found, through the light within them, there was a way of living in the light. And that light, as it was lived out, then bore witness so that other people could say, yes, there is an alternative that's possible. People can live differently, societies can live differently. We don't have to, as long as we're liberated from this desire to own, possess, and control. So I've summarized all too quickly what I was going to say, but that's quite enough for you to be thinking about. Thank you.
Thank you, Rex. Thank you. We have an opportunity now if anyone would like to ask questions of Rex as a result of that talk before we take a break and get some refreshments.